This episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Wrong Turn Down Isabelle Street. Hoovering along the dusty alley where 3-year-old Stephanie Cohen was slain, residents of the mostly Hispanic Cypress Park neighborhood shared the shock and anguish of the city at large. But they also expressed their particular despair that it had taken the death of a white child to draw attention to the urban war zone in which they live. The killing took place on an early Sunday morning as Timothy Stone, 25, drove home a carload of people from a birthday barbecue for a friend. Unfamiliar with the neighborhood and not noticing the dead-end sign, Mr. Stone mistakenly turned onto Isabelle Street, a dark, narrow alley of a single stucco. After he had driven a short distance past a graffiti warning in Spanish, "Street Killers," the police said about 20 gang members surrounded Mr. Stone's car, barring the way with garbage cans and soiled mattresses and pelting the car with beer cans. As Mr. Stone desperately tried to drive through the barricade, gang members opened fire. One bullet struck Stephanie in the head and she lay in her mother's arms. Her 2-year-old brother Joseph was hit in the left foot and a bullet grazed Mr. Stone in the back. Immediately after the homicide, only one person was arrested in connection with the shooting, a 23-year-old neighborhood man, but authorities still cannot say definitively what prompted the fusillade. This case gained traction quick and the media attention was relentless. As reports of the killing spread, an outpouring of grief and sympathy came from near and far. The former Los Angeles County District Attorney Gil Garcetti vowed that the killers would spend the rest of their lives in prison. The City Council voted unanimously to ask the mayor to establish a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, and the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors voted to offer an equivalent amount. The case took on so much national attention that even former President Clinton took note. A family took a wrong turn, and because they were in the wrong place, gang members felt that they had the right to shoot them and take their lives and kill an innocent child, he said. The former chief, Willie Williams, of the police visited the site. People here said it was the first time they could recall that a high-ranking law enforcement official had come to the neighborhood, about 5 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. As many neighbors tell it, gang warfare and initiation rites, which have taken lives of numerous gang members as well as some innocent bystanders, are a fact of life here. These killings pass without much notice beyond the neighborhood and rarely garner national attention. This reality illustrates the inequity in how impoverished communities are treated versus the average suburb. It takes a murder of an innocent child like this in order to bring a spotlight to these types of neighborhoods before the media's bell is rung. For the community, this is life as usual, but until something diabolical like this happens, real everyday life in the ghetto is rarely exposed. As residents spoke of their frustration with trying to get the police and other officials to do something about the crime here, the issues of race invariably came up. There have been about 3 murders in the neighborhood recently, and none of them got this much response, said Jose Arturo, 45, who lives a few feet from where the shootings took place. He said he heard the hail of bullets, one which pierced his fence. 6 months ago, they killed someone nearby and the police didn't come, he said. They waited for more than an hour before showing up. The guy died in the street. Though the police have said that no one in the Stone car had any gang affiliation, one resident, Ray Martinez, 60, questioned why Mr. Stone's explanation for being in this area had been readily accepted. One thing to think about is why were they here at 1 a.m. with kids, he said. I don't know how many picnics that end at that hour. Nearby, a 39-year-old man who would not give his name because he feared gang retribution for simply speaking to a reporter, said race could be responsible for putting the spotlight on Isabelle Street. Maybe because the victim is white, he said. The police don't put a lot of attention to this area. If people are doing drugs or gang-related stuff, they think it's not important. Such sentiments can be an odd resonance. In Cypress Park, as in other such neighborhoods, the police are widely seen by residents as often guilty of the excesses of misconduct and recounted by the retired detective Mark Furman in the O.J. Simpson case. At the same time, residents have nowhere to turn but to the police to protect them from the brutality and lawlessness of the gangs. The walls of Isabelle Street are covered with gang graffiti. Many of the street lamps have been shot out, and when the sun goes down, residents say the darkened streets crawl with armed children. Every day, Black and Hispanic children are killed here, and the residents just want the same kind of attention given to them when it happens. It's irrefutably true that race of the victim determines the extent to which the media is paying attention to this case. If it had been a 3-year-old Latino girl from that neighborhood who had been killed, what people would have assumed, despite the fact that this girl was 3, would have been that she was caught up in a gang lifestyle. Regardless of public sentiment or how people feel about this case, the one thing that stands true is that the Avenues gang has a long violent history. The Avenues gang is named for the avenues that cross Figueroa Street in northeast Los Angeles, where the gang claims Highland Park and parts of Cypress Park, Glasso Park, and Eagle Rock as its turf. The group, which is linked to the Mexican Mafia prison gang, has a history of shootings and killings dating from at least the 1950s. This case involving the death of 3-year-old Stephanie Cohen put the Avenues on the national stage, but the gang is definitely no stranger to that kind of attention. In August 2008, several members of the gang were accused of killing Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriff Abel Escalante, 27, who worked at the men's central jail guarding some of the county's most dangerous inmates. Escalante was gunned down outside his parents' Cypress Park home as he prepared to go to work. In 2006, 4 members of the gang were convicted of violating federal hate crime laws through a series of chilling assaults and killings aimed at driving African Americans from a predominantly Latino community. This investigation culminated in 46 Avenue gang members and associates being picked up on a September 22, 2008 sweep based on a 222-page federal indictment that cited the murder of Deputy Abel Escalante, attempted murder, extortion, money laundering, intimidation, and plotting to smuggle drugs and cell phones into the state prisons. This case had all the elements of a typical indictment on a criminal organization like the Mexican Mafia. It's almost surreal when I step back and think about how many of the same activities the NF was indicted on, and just the parallels that illustrate how similar these two organizations are. Among the prizes in the indictment, the shocking arrest of prison guard Tammy Armstrong, accused of providing forbidden PIN numbers and calling cards to her alleged lover, a gang member in Kern Valley State Prison. But what the media hadn't grasped was that the big bust wasn't just another raid given prominent play in the Los Angeles Times and mentioned in East Coast papers as further proof that LA is run by thugs. To cops, armed with warrants, the raid was about the thin blue line. It was about attacking a cancer that has plagued northeast Los Angeles since the 1940s. But some cops knew the raid was about more than it was about avenging one of their own. They knew prosecutors had strong evidence that a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy had been assassinated months before by killers from that area who were out to settle a score. In a killing that stunned the community, Deputy Abel Escalante was shot near his driveway after transferring his child's safety seat between 2 family cars. The 2 Avenues members that shot Escalante did it with such stealth that Deputy Escalante didn't even see them until they were already on top of him. Investigators pursued many theories to explain his murder, including mistaken identity, a troubled marriage, and retaliation because of his job as a county jailer. LA Weekly has learned that prosecutors have strong evidence of a different motive. Escalante was gunned down in an act of symmetrical retribution, payback for the spectacular LAPD shootout on Drew Street. In the 1960s, the city built apartments on its dead-end streets and avenues, and a bad element moved in, seeing the isolated little neighborhood as a perfect lair. Drew Street, with its long straight rise, offered the perfect viewing base from which to espy the approaching cop cars. It turned out to be just the thing for Maria Chataleon, a young toughie from a rough, lawless Mexican village who settled there and gave birth to 13 children, a half dozen of whom became criminals. With a new baby on her hip every year or two, Leon dealt drugs and staked her claim on Drew Street in a bleak house stocked with guns and explosives. She regularly did stints in jail and prison, and her growing brood, the extended Leon crime family, which has close ties to the Avenues gang that controls the area, slowly turned Drew Street into a hellish micro-community that LA cops, politicians, and code enforcers could not turn around. But hope materialized when the city announced it was shutting down the home and banning most of the Leon brood from their longtime family compound. Leon was already gone, moved to Victorville, and many of her violent drug-dealing sons were in prison. Some Glasso Park neighborhoods who told stories of around-the-clock drug deals and rampant gang activity at the house, including a murder in Leon's front yard, began to hope the nightmare might be over. Then Drew Street erupted in AK-47 gunfire, forcing cops to evacuate 2 Los Angeles public schools and an entire neighborhood. And the son that some law enforcement officials described as the worst of Leon's boys, Danny Clever Leon, lay dead. The mayhem erupted at about 11:30 a.m. on February 21st, when 3 Avenues gangsters allegedly pulled up in 2 cars and opened fire on 36-year-old Marco Salas and his 2-year-old granddaughter near Aragon Avenue Elementary School in Cypress Park. Riddled with bullets, Salas, who had former gang ties, was killed instantly, but the tiny toddler survived. The shooting was over taxes the Mexican mafia collects on local drug sales and possibly in revenge for the 2007 death of Danny Leon's half-brother Randy Martinez. The gangsters then exchanged gunfire with occupants of a black van. Police speculate that the van was probably full of Cypress Park gangsters before heading back to Drew Street, where a series of gang-controlled homes and apartments are situated, almost mockingly a couple of 100 yards across the train tracks where LAPD's Northeast Station is located. There, police say the suspected shooters were confronted by gang officers and opened fire. Among them, Danny Leon, who was brandishing an AK-47 rifle, and his cousin, Jose Gomez, allegedly armed with a handgun. When the shootout ended, Danny lay dead, the AK-47 by his side, and Gomez was wounded. 6 hours later, a bevy of circling TV helicopters filming every movement, an LAPD K9 team arrested a 3rd suspect, Guillermo Ocampo. A 4th man, the driver of one of their cars, later identified as Rafael Stomper Carrillo, had vanished. Local residents nervously awaited word from police of his whereabouts, fearing he might show up near their homes. Most people don't gun down people with an AK-47, says a law enforcement officer who declined to be named, trying to describe just how frightening Danny Leon was, his dark behavior ingrained by a background where his mom is a drug dealer and his stepfathers are drug dealers. You were used to having people in your family killed. You hurt your closest friends. That is his life story. Even on LA's meanest streets, says this veteran officer, I don't think someone exactly like him comes around all that often. Carrillo, an alleged drug dealer on Drew Street, vanished after he and a carload of Avenues gang members allegedly exchanged gunfire with LAPD gang officers in the shootout that ended the life of Danny Leon, shutting down blocks of residential streets and a grade school while cops tracked down the shooters. Local residents have been sweating it ever since. Maria Leon moved to Drew Street around 1985. The once petite 5'2" toughie immediately got into a brush with cops, arrested in October of 1985 for assault with a deadly weapon. As her arrests piled up, so did her births, 13 kids by 4 or 5 men. Her sons, including Danny Leon, Nicholas Real, Randy Martinez, Francisco Real, and Jesus Martinez, all grew up on Drew Street, and most attended Fletcher Drive Elementary and Washington Irving Middle Schools. A law enforcement official says that Leon's arrest included theft in 1986, burglary in Riverside County in 1986, selling PCP and marijuana in 1992, extortion and drug dealing in 1994. She was finally convicted of drug felonies in 1995 and again in 1997, and by 1998 she was one of the first Avenues gangsters supervised by the probation department under the Clear Task Force, which was inspired by the horrific September 1995 murder of 3-year-old Stephanie Cohen after her parents made a wrong turn in their car and ended up in no man's land, an alley near Division Street in Glasso Park. That same year, Leon was convicted of petty theft. Her longest stint in prison came after a Halloween bust in 2002, when the Glendale Police Department used a search warrant to enter the longtime Leon home on Drew Street. She was arrested for narcotic sales and child endangerment after officers found automatic weapons and explosives throughout the home, where she was also raising young children. In 2003, while she was in prison, a local man was shot to death in her front yard, an apparent drug deal gone bad. Inside the house, the cops found a shrine to the patron saint of narco trafficking, Jesus Malverde, a folklore hero in crime-ridden Sinaloa. Danny Leon and his half-brother Francisco Real were convicted of accessory to murder in the killing. Then Maria Leon was released from state prison in 2006. One resident says the Leons and the Avenues gangs are constantly outsmarting the justice system. It is so weird. They go to jail and after a day they're out, says a resident who grew up with the Leon boys. How can it be so soon? How can they get out of jail so fast? People who work and have a good life, they get deported. Just over a year ago, police closed off a block of Drew Street with yellow crime tape. Black and white cruisers stood guard at the street's entrance. Locals peered out of windows from buildings scrawled with gang graffiti: Avs, Sicko, Hefty, and Chuco. Avenue's gang members stood in groups nearby, almost amused, as City Attorney Rocky Delgadillo announced that his office had boarded up the Leon family home for good. The Leon property, also known as the Satellite House because of the big satellite dish that sat on top of the rooftop, was one of the first targeted by the city attorney's nuisance abatement program, Project Tough, part of Delgadillo's plan to drive gangs out of the neighborhoods. It sounded like a good idea in 2005 when a Superior Court judge issued a preliminary injunction that mandated the eviction of Leon's son, Nicholas Real, whom Delgadillo alleged acted as a front for the family, selling drugs from the house. Incredibly, the judge named another 54 people either arrested at the house or identified as nuisances who are also prevented from going near it. That long list includes Maria and Danny Leon. This was one of the many chapters in the history of the Avenues gang. Two well-known brothers, Mexican Mafia leader Alex Pee Wee Aguirre and Mexican Mafia associate Rudy Little Pee Wee Aguirre, are also both from the Avenues gang. In 2003, Pee Wee was indicted on a federal RICO case and is currently serving a life sentence in federal prison. Pee Wee was the Avenues leader and has had a lot of influence within the gang. The Avenues gang had different subsets that represented different neighborhoods within the Glasso Park, Eagle Rock, and Highland Park areas, but Pee Wee's most loyal and deadliest crews were the Los Asesinos, the Assassins. The Asesinos had proven themselves not only to be adept at generating money for Pee Wee, but also for killing as well. Though Pee Wee continues to serve out a life sentence at the ADX Administrative Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado, Avenues gang members continue to demonstrate their loyalty to Pee Wee by sending regular payments to him in the form of tribute. It has now been nearly 20 years since the Avenues boss and Mexican Mafia member Alex Pee Wee Aguirre was sentenced to a life term. He turned over partial control of the gang to his brother, Richard Little Pee Wee Aguirre. At the time, some Avenues members felt like Little Pee Wee hadn't earned the right to lead the gang, and the prospect of taking orders from a 5'4", 14-year-old just didn't bode well with some of them. Testimony from the spring trial showed how the elder Aguirre, through a network inside and outside of prison, continued to direct the powerful drug distribution network. The Avenues boss received a life sentence for the murder of Mexican Mafia member Manuel Rocky Luna, an unpaid advisor on the Almost movie American Me. The movie had angered Mexican Mafia members because of its depiction of the excesses of a gangster's life. Luna's body was found slumped over the wheel of a car in the parking lot of the Ramona Gardens housing project in 1993. Aguirre was also convicted of the attempted murder of 6 Cypress Park gang members, all of whom he had shaken down for tax money. and for conspiring to kill gang member Donald Littleman Ortiz. It was not long before Little Pee Wee got himself into trouble doing his and his brother's bidding. As soon as he stepped into the position of the gang's new leader, he came in heavy-handed, and it was obvious that he was trying to prove his mettle. The other members acknowledged him as their new leader, and they complied with the elder Gary's wishes, but Little Pee Wee sensed this and knew that he not only had to earn the respect from the gang, he also had to earn the right to be their new leader. Being the younger brother of Pee Wee and the nephew of Mexican Mafia member Richard Psycho Gary would only carry him so far. He had to stand up on his own 2 feet and prove that he was capable of building his own legacy. But proving himself would also become his own undoing. Soon after taking control of the gang, he ordered 3 murders that law enforcement took notice of. These murders were done in haste, out of desperation, not by a leader who was calculating and savvy, but by someone who had an agenda. The murders were messy, and law enforcement knew that he was responsible for ordering them. Little Pee Wee would ride his bike in his neighborhood, trying to pass himself off as a normal 14-year-old teenager. But while he was on his bike, he'd also be on his cell phone ordering murders and coordinating gang taxes. The first murder he ordered was on an Avenue's associate named Joseph Torres. Little Pee Wee had Torres killed because he had heard Torres was collecting Mexican Mafia taxes in an area that was considered to be Avenue's territory. The second murder he ordered was on another Avenue's associate who refused to pay drug taxes. On February 21, 2008, Marco Salas was walking with his 5-year-old granddaughter when he was gunned down. Salas took 5 shots, but miraculously the child wasn't hit. The third murder he ordered was on an Avenue's enemy, Raul Rodriguez, for snitching on a fellow Avenue's member. Rodriguez, a 27-year-old Alpine gang member, was killed on April 11, 1996. Rodriguez allegedly told homicide detectives that Richard Stalker Ramirez had killed someone at a New Year's Eve party the year before. It proved hard for the younger Aguirre to rule with the iron fist of his brother. Bottom line, the indictment against the elder Aguirre in 1995 tore the head off the serpent. Other people have surfaced and a power struggle has ensued between different members of the Avenue Street Gang. Because Alex Aguirre was in federal custody, he couldn't maintain control. He had a group of people who were loyal to him, but as other people considered the man's plight, that he was doing life in another state, it left the door open for others to exert control. The powerful Aguirre could do nothing to protect his brother from the testimony of 2X Avenue's members who knew enough about these 3 crimes to threaten Little Pee Wee's hold on the gang. On August 14, 1995, a reputed drug dealer named Alan Downey, 31, was found dead lying across the front seat of his car on Eagle Rock Boulevard. His girlfriend, Judy Gutierrez, later told the police Downey worked for Alex Aguirre but refused to pay taxes to him for the drugs he was selling out of a bar in Highland Park. Somebody gave the message that I would have to start paying taxes. Fuck that, I don't pay rent to anybody, he allegedly told Gutierrez. His resistance is ultimately what got him killed. Little Pee Wee's reign was over just as fast as it started. He took over as the gang shot caller in 1994, but it ended in 1995 when he was linked to these 3 murders. His trial lasted for several years due to the difficult task of getting members to cooperate with police. In the end, 2X Avenue members cooperated, telling a shocking tale of robberies, assaults, and murders. Initially, Little Pee Wee was sentenced to serve 25 years in state prison with 5 years of supervised release. But later, he would get indicted again on another federal RICO indictment that would land him in federal prison with his older brother and uncle. This testimony gave law enforcement the blueprints and intricacies it needed in order to infiltrate the gang and its operations. One of the main FBI agents that was assigned to investigate the Avenues, Jerry Fridella, spoke about the meetings a clique of Avenues held off and on with some 50 members at the Montesino Heights Recreation Center to talk about the blacks in the neighborhood and how they had to get rid of them. They thought there were too many around, said Fridella. It's like a blanket policy for them. The Avenues have a well-documented history of attacking blacks dating to the early 90s when 3 black family members were shot and injured by gang members after they moved into the apartment on 58th and Benner Streets in Highland Park. There's a lot of motivating factors. There's a lot of hatred between Hispanics and blacks within the prison system. What happens on the inside translates to the outside. When there's an incident inside the penal system, it spreads to hate crimes on the streets. All that matters is the color of your skin. Anthony Prudhomme was an easy target for the Avenues. He was naive, trustworthy, and a friend to all. The 6'3", 155-pound free spirit was born at Glendale Adventist Medical Center on November 27, 1978. Ascending the steep steps that lead from the street to the scene of her son's murder, 47-year-old Louisa Prudhomme reaches over a gate and gives a guard dog a rough pat on the head. "Sam doesn't seem to remember me," she says. What Prudhomme will never forget is that just past the snarling Doberman is the apartment on a hill where 6 years ago her 21-year-old son Anthony was shot in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic while lying on a futon she had purchased for him at IKEA. He died wearing a shirt that read, "Keep the peace." Anthony Prudhomme was slain by members of the Avenues, but he was not a rival gang member or a police informant or a drug dealer. The Avenues did not target him for the content of his character or even the contents of his apartment. They targeted him for the color of his skin. Prudhomme was murdered because he identified himself as black. He was in fact mixed race in a neighborhood occupied by one of the many Latino street gangs in Los Angeles County. Incredibly, even though these gangs are fundamentally criminal enterprises interested mainly in money, gang experts inside and outside the government say that they are now engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing, racial terror that is directed solely at the African Americans. The way I hear these knuckleheads tell it, they don't want their neighborhoods infested with blacks, as if it's an infestation, says respected Los Angeles gang expert Tony Raphael, who interviewed several Latino street gang leaders for an upcoming book on the Mexican Mafia. It's pure racial animosity that manifests itself in the policy of a major criminal organization. The one perplexing thing about it that I can't bring myself to understand is how and why minorities can hate each other when there's so many opposing things in this world that should be binding us together. We live in the same ghettos, we struggle the same struggles, and we're oppressed by a common enemy. It's just not supposed to be that way. There's absolutely no motive absent the color of our skin. And don't get me wrong, the sword cuts both ways. It's definitely a double-edged blade. Some blacks are taught to hate Mexicans from a young age. There's this common perception that's out there about Mexicans that's even echoed within the political arenas. All Mexicans cross the border. None of them have their papers. They're willing to work for dirt poor wages, and that has the ability to collapse the economy. Put them all on a boat and send them back to Mexico. Racism's ugly, but if we're going to confront it, we've got to be real about it. If an African American enters the Avenues neighborhood, they're likely to be injured or killed. On the night Prudhomme was murdered, he received a call from a friend who wanted to stop by to see him. Prudhomme turned down the offer and said that he had to get to work by 6 a.m. to unload a truck. He never made it. Around 2 a.m., 2 men broke into his apartment and shot him twice, once in the face and once in the back of the head. They used a pillow to muffle the sound, but the gunshots awakened his landlord sleeping upstairs, who called the police. 6 years after Prudhomme was gunned down, the racist campaign continues. He posed no threat to the Avenues. They didn't even know each other, but he was still murdered 2 months after he moved into Highland Park. He had nothing when they broke in. So to shoot him, I'm sure it was a stripe. They get stripes for killing black people. Stripes are a gang soldier's badges of honor. Latino gang members in Southern California earn them by doing the bidding of their godfathers in the Mexican Mafia, a powerful criminal syndicate based in the California state prison system that controls most Latino street gangs south of Bakersfield. According to gang experts and law enforcement agents, they have evidence that the Mexican Mafia has issued a green light on all blacks in certain neighborhoods, and this stems from a long-standing war that evolved with the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, in the prison system. This rivalry, a sort of gang life fatwa, amounts to a standing authorization for Latino gang members to prove their mettle by terrorizing or even murdering any blacks sighted in a neighborhood claimed by a gang loyal to the Mexican Mafia. This attitude is pretty pervasive throughout most of the members of the Avenue gang. Bottom line, as long as street gangs are heavily influenced by the prison gangs, particularly the Mexican Mafia, racism is just part and parcel of why they come into being and why they continue to exist. Last fall, 4 members of the Avenues were convicted of federal charges for conspiring to deprive blacks of their civil rights in Highland Park. 3 of them were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A month later, a 4th was to be sentenced the following month. The violence is not even limited to Los Angeles County. In another case, 6 members of a Latino gang in Carlsbad, California were arrested and charged with hate crimes for allegedly hurling racial slurs at a black teenager, who police said was not a gang member, while kicking and punching him. The same month, 2 members of the Fresno Bulldogs, a Latino gang in Fresno, California, were convicted of attempted murder in what police described as the random hate crime shooting of a 41-year-old black. According to police, the shooters used racial epithets and told the victim, "We don't like your kind of people on our street." Since 1990, the African American population of Los Angeles has dropped by half as blacks relocated to the suburbs, and Latinos have moved into historically black neighborhoods. Traversing South Central LA today, it's obvious that the urban landscape has changed radically since the Bloods vs. Crips era depicted in movies like Colors, Boys in the Hood, and Menace to Society. Not only are there vastly fewer black people walking the streets, there are vastly fewer obvious black gang members. Beige skin and baggy khakis have displaced the red and blue bandanas of the Bloods and the Crips. In Highland Park, located just north of downtown and one of the oldest settled areas in Los Angeles, there have been at least 3 racially motivated green light murders committed by members of the Avenue since 1999. Besides Anthony Prudhomme, the victims include Christopher Bowser, a black man who was bullied and sporadically assaulted for years by Avenue's members, then gunned down in broad daylight at a bus stop, and Kenneth Curry Wilson, who didn't even live in the vicinity. Bowser was killed 1 month later. Bowser was shot once in the back of the head while waiting at a bus stop on Figueroa Street on his way to visit friends. His killer and another gunman jumped out of a car, ran up to him and fired. The father of 4 died instantly. The police speculated that Bowser was killed for filing a police report alleging that an Avenue's gang member had robbed him of a gold chain. Bowser had been regularly chased down the street, threatened, and on at least one occasion been beaten by members of the 43rd Avs, who ruled the turf where Bowser lived with his mother on Avenue 44 since 1989. The 3rd victim, Kenneth Wilson, was simply parking his car to drop off his nephew after a late night at a bar when he crossed paths with Avenue's gang members riding in a stolen van. He was gunned down on April 18, 1999 while parking his Cadillac on Avenue 52, a street claimed by the 43rd Avs. The 38-year-old African American had been visiting a friend and dropping his nephew off when gang members drove up in a stolen van and saw him. 3 of them allegedly jumped out of the vehicle and shot him several times. According to later court testimony, one of the gang members spotted Wilson and said, "Hey, wanna kill a ninja?" The group opened fire on Wilson, killing him instantly. The murders of Wilson and Bowser resulted in a groundbreaking criminal case by the U.S. Department of Justice in which Alejandro Burb Martinez, Fernando Sneaky Cesares, Gilbert Lucky Saldana, and Porfirio Dreamer Avila were convicted of violating federal hate crime laws and later sentenced to life in federal prison. Avila was already serving life in prison after being prosecuted by the state of California for his role in the killings, while Saldana was incarcerated for his role in another murder. In 2004, federal authorities armed with new information indicted the 4 Avenues members on federal weapons charges and civil rights charges in connection with Wilson's and Bowser's killings and considered the death penalty. Alejandro Burb Martinez, who allegedly called the hit on Bowser from jail, is one of the Avenues named. The indictment includes several other attacks against blacks, such as the beating of a man who had just moved into the neighborhood, an assault on a group of men playing basketball in Montecito Park, racial slurs directed at a girl in a supermarket, drawing chalk outlines of human bodies in the driveway of a black man's residence home, and the beating of a black man who stopped to use a payphone on the street. In the past, prosecutors have typically used civil rights violation conspiracy laws against members of white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan. The federal case against the Avenues gang marked the first time the Department of Justice used such laws against members of a non-white criminal organization, officials said. Until Anthony Prudhomme's murderers went on trial, it never dawned on his mother, Louisa, and his stepfather, Lavelle, that the killing was racially motivated. It wasn't until we went to trial that we really began to understand that race was the reason, he says, which seems totally, for the lack of a better word, stupid. Since the trial, Louisa has become obsessed with the Avenues gang. She routinely drives into Highland Park looking for signs of the gang, talking to anyone willing to talk. She has homicide detectives, lawyers, and parole officers on her cell phone speed dial. She's made numerous visits to the site of her son's murder, as well as the spots where Bowser and Wilson were shot down. Believing her son's killer has yet to be found, Louisa continues to post reward signs throughout the neighborhood, usually right next to Avenues gang graffiti. Driving through Highland Park one afternoon, Louisa headed up Avenue 43 toward Montecito Heights Community Center, a known Avenues congregation spot. She pulled up alongside a man loading lawnmowers into a huge shed. The man grabbed the left door, which was decorated with a full-length spray-painted 4, and joined it with the right door, which was tagged with the matching 3. When the doors were closed, they created the 4-3 emblem of the Avenues. Louisa asked the man, who was Latino, if he spoke English. He did, and they chatted for about 5 minutes about the infamous Avenues 43 and the tattoos they leave all over the area he landscapes. Louisa walked away from him, laughing before turning to say, "I hope they get them all. We want to get them all off the streets." But with the Mexican Mafia shadow looming over Los Angeles, it may be a long time before the rapidly growing number of streets claimed by Latino gangs are safe for blacks, if ever. It's not just Highland Park, it's almost anywhere in LA that you could find yourself in a difficult position as a black person, says Louisa. All blacks are on a green light status no matter where you're at. Meanwhile, on August 1st, 1997, another chapter in the Avenida Asesinos, Street of Killers, or Murderers Alley, violent history finally came to a close. The Cohen family and 3-year-old Stephanie finally got the justice that they had been. Los Angeles Supreme Court Judge Edward Ferns sentenced 28-year-old Anthony Gabriel Rodriguez, 22-year-old Manuel Rosales Jr., and 18-year-old Hugo David Gomez to a 54-year and 8-month sentence in state prison. In this moment, 17-year-old Agustin Lizama's grandmother tried to defend him. This prompted the judge to repeat the hearing. During the sentencing of 3 convicted murderers, Margaret Fregoso, Grandma Rodriguez, defended him and said that people outside the court assumed that the car Cohen traveled around the areas that once or more passengers could buy drugs. Robin Cohen, the mother of Stephanie Cohen, said that her family tried to find the shortest way home and said the statements Fregoso has made was simply not true. The defense suggested that the Cohen family knew the layout of the terrain and would not have found himself in his car. On Friday, August 29, 1997, Lizama made a deal in which he received a conviction for assault. The defendants that were convicted for killing 3-year-old Stephanie Cohen were also accused of killing Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriff Abel Escalante. At the conclusion of the trial, Robin Cohen gave an impact statement and described some of the events that happened the night her daughter Stephanie was murdered. She told the judge that they had been at a friend's house earlier in the evening and that they had exited the freeway so that they could all stop somewhere to use the bathroom. After they stopped, gassed up, and all the kids had used the restroom, they decided to drive through the city because of bumper-to-bumper traffic on the freeway. When they got in the area of Highland Park and Glasso Park, that's when they really became lost. It seemed like the city streets were closing in on us because the streets just got so narrow. We were driving around in circles trying to figure out how to get out of this huge maze because every time we turned down a street, we hit another dead end. At one point, she said they began to panic because they could tell they were in some unsavory neighborhoods. We had probably turned down about 6 or 7 dead-end streets before we finally turned down Isabelle. This street was real narrow, but the thing that stood out about it the most is that it was extremely dark. When Timothy got to the end of the street and we came to another dead end, I knew we were in trouble. It was almost like all the shadows around us came alive, and before we knew it, we had anywhere from 20 to 30 gang members on top of us. Without warning, all of a sudden our cars started getting hit with rocks and bottles, and they surrounded us. Up until that point, both Joseph and Stephanie were both asleep, but as soon as the rocks and bottles started hitting the car, it terrified them and they both started screaming. Timothy was doing his best to back the car up or turn it around, but now these guys were throwing whole mattresses and garbage cans in the street behind us. They were trying to trap us in there. Now I was beginning to not only fear for my life, but more so for my baby's lives as well. I just didn't know what these guys wanted or what they were gonna do. This is about the time that I heard the car getting hit with something that sounded different from the rocks and bottles. When I tried to console my children, this is when I realized what those different sounds were. I was on my knees in the front seat holding Stephanie and facing Joseph when all of a sudden I seen something hit his left foot with so much force that it nearly turned him sideways in his car seat. It was a bullet. These guys were actually shooting at us. Joseph's sock became soaked with his blood about 3 seconds after he was hit. He was bleeding profusely. Just as I was attempting to pull him out of his car seat and shield him in the front seat with me and Tim, the back window exploded and I immediately knew what happened. I looked down at Stephanie and I could see a huge hole in the back of her head. At that point, I just lost it. There was blood everywhere and I knew she was gone. They killed my baby for no reason because we made a wrong turn and entered their neighborhood without their permission. Neighbors that lived on Isabelle Street didn't dare go outside to see what was happening. They already knew, and several of them called 911 after hearing the gunshots. When Tim finally got the car turned around and we were driving back down Isabelle, they continued to shoot at us, and this is when Timothy Stone was hit in the back by a single bullet. Luckily for the Coens, there were officers in the area and they arrived within minutes. They immediately began to work on Mr. Stone and Joseph's injuries, but there was nothing they could do for 3-year-old Stephanie. Her injuries were grave and she was pronounced dead at the scene. In September 1995, after authorities urged the public to come forward and identify other suspects in the killing of Stephanie Coen, the community finally spoke. Those that were tried and convicted had long been sent to prison, and we assumed that this case was over. However, we received information that there might be additional suspects that were still out there. That's when investigators began knocking on doors and urging Angelinos to come forward and help us take this monster off the street. Due to the community's help, Vincent Caldera, 23, a parole killer on another murder, was arrested in connection to Coen's murder. Later, Caldera, unsuccessful at pleading down to a manslaughter, also received a 54-year sentence. As of today, Rodriguez is housed at Chuckawalla Valley State Prison. Rosales is currently housed at CSP, Los Angeles County, and Gomez is currently housed at Pelican Bay State Prison. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. We should be dropping either something on Mac Dre's Romper Room Gang or the case that inspired the movie Dead Presidents. As always, thank you guys for supporting us.